Imagine this. It's the spring of 1943. High above Europe, squadrons of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators push deeper into German skies. Their gunners are on edge, scanning the clouds for Messerschmitt 109 seconds or Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. But suddenly something flashes past. It's not a piston engine fighter. It's faster, sleeker, and gone before the gunners can even swing their .50 calibers around. The radios explode with panic. This isn't science fiction. It was the jet age arriving. A year earlier than history records, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, didn't enter combat until the summer of 1944. By then, the war in Europe was already tilting heavily in the Allies' favor. But what if it had entered the skies in 1943 instead? Would the Allied bombing campaign have collapsed? Could Germany have bought enough time to force a stalemate or even negotiate peace on its terms? Or was the Reich already too broken for any wonder weapon, no matter how advanced, to change its fate? That's the story we're diving into, the story of the jet that came too late, and the terrifying question, what if it hadn't? It's hard to imagine now, but in 1943, the skies were still ruled by piston engines. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Focke-Wulf 190. All of them mechanical marvels of their age, but all of them still chained to the propeller. Then came the Me-262. On paper, it was almost science fiction. Twin jet engines mounted under sleek, swept wings, capable of speeds over 540 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, a Mustang in a dive might scrape past 440. The Me-262 could cruise faster than most Allied fighters could dive. Its armament was just as terrifying. 4 30mm Mk, 108 cannons packed into the nose. Each round the size of a small soda bottle. A single hit could rip a flying fortress in half. Bomber crews called them one-shot kills. So why didn't this miracle machine dominate the skies from the beginning? The answer lies in the engines, the Jumo 004 turbojets. They were brilliant, but fragile. Built with metals Germany didn't have in abundance, they burned out after just 25 hours of flying. Pilots were told not to touch the throttle too suddenly, or the entire engine could explode in flames. Here's the irony. The Me-262 was both ahead of its time and trapped in it. The world's first jet fighter existed in a country already running out of the rare metals needed to make it reliable. But now, picture this. Instead of entering the war in mid-1944, what if those teething issues had been solved and the jet arrived 1 year earlier? The Allies were still preparing for the Great Bomber Offensive. Their long-range escort fighters weren't fully ready. Their bomber formations, flying into the heart of Germany, were already suffering heavy losses to propeller-driven aircraft. Add jets into the mix, the skies might have turned into a slaughterhouse. 1943 was the year the air war truly turned into a battle for Europe's future. The Allies had a plan: choke Germany from above. Thousands of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were being built, with the goal of smashing German industry, railways, and morale. By mid-year, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched deeper raids into the heart of the Reich. Factories at Regensburg, ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, U-boat yards on the North Sea. But there was a catch. These bombers didn't yet have long-range escorts. The Mustang was still in development, and the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt didn't have the legs to reach Berlin and back. That meant once the bomber streams pushed past the French border, they were on their own, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. Messerschmitt 109 seconds, and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds swarmed the formations, tearing into the flying fortresses. In October of that year, the second Schweinfurt raid saw 60 B-17 seconds lost out of just over 200. Hundreds of airmen never made it home. Losses were so staggering that some commanders questioned if the bombing campaign was sustainable at all. Now pause and imagine, that's with piston engine fighters. What if jets had been there? A squadron of Me-262 seconds could slice through bomber boxes in seconds. They didn't need to dogfight, just a high-speed pass, a burst of 30 millimeters fire, and entire bombers would vanish in fireballs. The Luftwaffe might have turned devastating raids into outright massacres. But here's the twist. The air war in 1943 wasn't just about firepower, it was about momentum. The Allies were learning, adapting, and producing at an industrial scale the Germans couldn't match. Picture this. You're a 19-year-old tail gunner in a B-17 Flying Fortress. You've already seen your share of danger, Focke-Wulfs diving in, Messerschmitts slicing past, cannon shells hammering at your formation. But today feels different. You spot something streaking in from above. At first, you think it's a 109 diving, but then you realize it's too fast, way too fast. It crosses the formation in seconds, spits fire from its nose, and a bomber in the next box erupts into flames. Before you can even get a bead, it's gone. That was the nightmare scenario of the Me-262. Not just its speed, not just its firepower, but the sheer helplessness it created in bomber crews. Gunners trained to track enemy fighters simply couldn't keep up. Their 50 cals weren't designed to swing that fast. Even if you did hit the jet, its armor was thicker than most fighters. 1 or 2 rounds wouldn't stop it. And all the while, more jets were circling back for another pass. Imagine the psychology. Crews already faced odds where every mission felt like Russian roulette. Add in a new weapon, one they'd never seen before, one they couldn't fight the way they'd been trained. Morale might have cracked wide, open. There are stories from 1944-45, when jets finally appeared, of bomber groups radioing in sheer panic. They're too fast, we can't touch them. And by then, the Allies had escorts. In 1943, without Mustangs at their side, the bombers would have been sitting ducks. Losses might have climbed so high that generals in Washington and London would have been forced to rethink the strategy entirely. Would daylight bombing have continued? Or would the Allies have been pushed back to night raids only, like the RAF? And here's the ripple effect. If American bombing had been cut back in 1943, German industry might have survived longer. Oil plants, ball-bearing factories, and jet assembly lines could have kept working. The war might have dragged on for years more. But here's the catch. Terror cuts both ways. The Me-262 wasn't just a weapon of fear for bomber crews. It was also a logistical nightmare for its own pilots. Engines failed mid-air. Takeoff and landing were dangerous. So ask yourself, would the shock factor alone have been enough to change the war, or would the jet's flaws have caught up just as fast? The Me-262 was supposed to be Germany's trump card. But like so many things in the Reich, politics and ego nearly sabotaged it before it even reached the skies. The jet's chief designer, Willy Messerschmitt, envisioned it as a pure interceptor, a fast, high-altitude predator designed to tear apart bomber streams. Luftwaffe generals agreed. The Reich needed a way to stop the thousands of Allied bombers flattening German cities, but Adolf Hitler saw something different. He was obsessed with offense, not defense. In his mind, Germany didn't need another fighter. It needed a blitz bomber that could strike London and Allied supply lines. When he first saw the Me-262, he reportedly called it the Stormbird and demanded it be redesigned to carry bombs. That order cost Germany precious time. Engineers scrambled to modify the jet into a fighter bomber, strapping on bomb racks and altering systems. Pilots were frustrated. The Luftwaffe leadership begged to focus on the fighter version. But Hitler, still dreaming of knocking Britain out of the war with bold offensives, wouldn't listen. Now, here's the twist. If the Me-262 had entered service in 1943, would Hitler have made the same demand? Or would desperation with cities already under fire and the Eastern Front bleeding have forced him to accept it as a defensive fighter first? Let's speculate. If the jet had been allowed to enter service in its pure fighter form in 1943, it might have reached Allied bombers a full year earlier. The effect could have been catastrophic for American daylight raids. But here's the irony. Even when Hitler finally agreed to fighter deployment in 1944, it was already too late. The Allies had Mustangs sweeping the skies, fuel shortages were crippling training, and pilots were green teenagers thrown into cockpits. So we're left with a haunting question. Was it really Hitler's meddling that doomed the jet? Or was Germany's war machine already stretched so thin that no amount of fighter production could have saved it? Here's the brutal truth about wonder weapons. A machine can be decades ahead of its time, but if you can't build it in numbers, it's just a prototype. The Me-262 is the perfect example. Even when it entered service in 1944, production was a nightmare. Each jet required advanced alloys. Germany was already short of high-temperature metals like chromium and nickel. Without them, the Jumo 004 jet engines wore out in as little as 10 hours of flight. Factories were under constant bombardment. Allied raids targeted not just cities, but the entire industrial web, ball-bearing plants, transportation hubs, fuel refineries. Every time Germany tried to ramp up production of the jet, another raid would set them back. And there's another hidden detail. The jet was incredibly complex to assemble. Unlike the rugged Focke-Wulf 190, which could be cranked out in dispersed factories, the Me-262 required precision engineering. That meant fewer planes, built more slowly, at a time when the Allies were flooding the skies with thousands of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires. So imagine 1943. Even if the jet had entered service early, could Germany have produced enough to matter? The numbers tell the story. Between 1943 and 1945, Germany built around 1,400 Me-262 seconds, but at any given moment, only a few hundred were operational. Contrast that with the US, which produced over 15,000 P-51 seconds. The Allies had sheer numbers on their side, and it wasn't just planes, it was fuel. By late 1943, Germany was already running short of aviation fuel. Even piston fighters were rationed. Jets guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. Would the Luftwaffe have been able to keep them in the air? Or would most have sat idle on airfields, waiting for fuel that never came? There's a haunting irony here. Even if Germany had solved the technical challenges and rolled out jets earlier, Allied bombing campaigns might still have strangled production before the planes could turn the tide. So we come to the real question: what matters more in war? A few advanced weapons that inspire fear, or the ability to mass-produce thousands of reliable ones? One thing history proves: the Allies didn't sit still. Every German weapon that shocked them, the U-boat, the V-1 rocket, the Tiger tank, was eventually met with a countermeasure. The Me-262 would have been no different. If jets had appeared in 1943, the first response would have been simple: find them on the ground. Allied intelligence was already tracking German airfields. A jet had to use long, paved runways, and its engines took precious seconds to spool up. That made takeoff and landing the Me-262's most vulnerable moments. In reality, late-war Mustangs often circled near jet bases, waiting to pounce on them during landing approaches. In 1943, Thunderbolts and Lightnings might have been assigned that very task. Second, the Allies would have adjusted escort development. The P-51 Mustang, with its long-range capability, was rushed into frontline service in late 1943 and early 1944. If jets had appeared earlier, the political and military pressure to fast-track the Mustang might have been overwhelming. Imagine Mustangs filling the skies months sooner, built in even greater numbers. Then there's radar. By 1943, Allied radar networks were already sophisticated. Once the jets were identified as a new threat, radar-directed interception tactics would have been refined to concentrate fighters in their path. Speed gave the Me-262 an edge, but predictability could be exploited. And don't forget the arms race. Britain had its own jet program, the Gloucester Meteor. It entered service in 1944, mainly used against V-1 rockets. But if the Me-262 had shocked the Allies in 1943, the Meteor and other jet projects might have been accelerated. Within a year, the Allies could have had jets of their own in combat. So the real danger of the Me-262 inches 1,943 isn't just the damage it could do, it's the chain reaction it would trigger. The Allies, with far larger industrial capacity, might have responded with overwhelming force, faster, harder, and with newer technology of their own. In other words, the Me-262 might have bought Germany time, but also pushed the Allies into the future faster. Here's the hard truth. Wars aren't won by a single machine. They're won by economies, supply chains, and the ability to keep fighting when everything is collapsing. By 1943, Germany was already bleeding on multiple fronts. In the east, the Red Army had stopped the Wehrmacht cold at Stalingrad and was beginning its brutal push westward. On the seas, Allied convoys were finally turning the tide against the U-boats, keeping Britain supplied. And in the skies, despite horrific losses, the Allied bomber offensive was beginning to strangle German industry. Fuel shortages alone posed a crippling problem. Jets drank aviation fuel at rates Germany simply couldn't sustain. By late 1944, Luftwaffe commanders were begging for resources just to keep training pilots. New jets often sat idle on runways, while inexperienced crews were rushed into combat, with only a handful of hours in the cockpit. Then there was manpower. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing its most experienced aces. Men like Galland, Barkhorn, and Hartmann couldn't be everywhere at once. Replacements were teenagers with minimal training, facing enemy pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time. The jet may have been powerful, but without skilled men to fly it, it couldn't reach its full potential. Even production numbers tell the same story. While Germany struggled to build a few hundred jets, the Allies were producing fighters and bombers in the tens of thousands. No matter how advanced the Me-262 was, it could never exist in numbers large enough to overwhelm that tide. So perhaps the real answer is this. The Me-262 might have changed the tempo of the war, but not its outcome. It could have forced the Allies to adapt faster, slowed down the bombing offensive, maybe even delayed D-Day by months. But Germany's collapse was already written into the wider picture. Too many enemies, too few resources, too much war on too many fronts. The Messerschmitt Me-262 remains one of history's greatest what-if machines. On the drawing board, it was decades ahead of its time. In the air, it could tear apart bombers and outrun nearly anything the Allies had. To the crews who faced it in late 1944, it seemed less like an airplane and more like a glimpse of the future. But history isn't kind to miracles that arrive too late. Even if the jet had entered combat in 1943, it would have faced the same problems that plagued it in 1944: fragile engines, fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, and an enemy with overwhelming industrial power. It might have inflicted greater losses, maybe forced the Allies to rethink daylight bombing, maybe even delayed the invasion of France. But could it have changed the ultimate outcome of the war? Almost certainly not. The Me-262 is a reminder that wars aren't won by wonder weapons alone. They're won by the slow grind of supply lines, manpower, and strategy. Germany's fate in 1943 was already sealed by overreach, by fighting too many enemies at once, and by draining its resources dry. And yet, imagine being an Allied gunner, watching a silver streak rip through your formation at twice the speed of sound you were used to. Imagine being a young German pilot, strapping into a jet no one had ever flown before, told it might save your country, but knowing your engine could fail before you even got home. The Me-262 didn't change the war, but it did change history. It pointed to the world that was coming, a world of jets, of speed, of air combat redefined forever. In that sense, it wasn't a weapon of victory, but a harbinger of the future. So, let me leave you with this. If the Me-262 had ruled the skies in 1943, would the war have ended differently, or was Germany already too far gone? Tell me what you think in the comments below.